Okay, we might get started, and apologies for a dog barking in the background that I have. So welcome to the next in the series of seminars celebrating 10 years of cats. Today, we're very fortunate to have Dr. Myzoon Ali, who is the lead for the Aphasia Data Sets Working Group 1. So Myzoon is a senior research fellow, well known to many of us, who works on big data to answer, using big data and answering research questions based on collaborations, international collaborations that help to coordinate research trials and also improve outcomes, including looking at standardization of outcome measurement. So today, Myzoon will be providing an overview of the CATS Working Group 1 activities using aphasia data sets and some of the key projects from this working group. Thank you very much, Myzoon.
Thank you very much. I'm just going to share my screen here and hopefully you can see the presentation. Okay, so I'm going to give an overview of CATS Working Group 1, but I have to say there's a caveat here because CATS Working Group 1 was established in 2020, and because of the pandemic and various other things, we haven't got a lot to report. But in saying that, there is still quite a lot we can talk about with CATS Working Group 1. So just what I'm going to cover today is the theory and the ethos and the kind of the theme behind Working Group 1, which is looking at the research potential of using existing data sets to answer new research questions. So we're going to look at how analyses based on these existing databases can have still have impact after the primary publications have come out. And I'm also going to go through some of the steps that are needed to build and maintain such a collaborative resource. Okay, so when we're talking about data, there's lots of different types of data out there. There's lots of types of big data sets as well. What I'm going to focus on mainly is the clinical trial and other prospectively collected data sets. But in saying that, there is a lot of data that is available in administrative data sets. These are usually collected for operational purposes by different kind of government bodies, for example, or hospitals. They're routinely collected, they have really large sample sizes, they have a really good longitudinal approach, and they're often very good for the who, what, and where questions, but not necessarily for the why questions. These administrative data sets don't necessarily cover an entire population, but they do cover quite a sizable chunk of a demographic that are of interest. The thing with administrative data as well is they might have quite a bit of missing data depending on whose responsibility it is to upload data or make sure things are being continually updated. And one of the caveats with administrative data sets is it may not necessarily align with your own research needs. So when we look at clinical trial data as well, it relates to a very specific research aim, the original aims of that clinical trial. They have really robust data collection practices, and they often have very robust pre-specified time points for data collection and follow-up. It's often accompanied by published protocols and documentation for data collection, such as case report forms. The clinical trials can be highly specific in one specific topic area or even a niche area within that topic area. But what you'll find is there are fewer instances of missing data within clinical trial data. And then when we look at prospectively collected data sets, we often see there's a mix of the two. So a mix of the administrative data sets and a mix of the clinical trial, the good and the bad from the clinical trials as well. So when we're talking about CATS Working Group 1, we are mainly talking about these clinical trial data sets and the other prospectively collected data sets, these large kind of cohort data sets. Okay, so when we're thinking of why create such data repository, what are the benefits of it? If you think about all the different studies that have been published on prevalence, on incidence, on geographic disparities and outcomes, on different risk factors, on treatments, or different types of interventions within these broad treatment types, there's a wealth of data out there that make up each of these studies. And many studies worldwide have investigated all of these factors. Datasets from such studies often reside in industry or in academia, and they just go into archives long after the studies have been published, but the potential of such data is often underestimated. because when we analyse reliable data, it can help us direct future research and still influence clinical care. The value of these kind of data can be maximised through reuse for novel exploratory analyses. So there's a lot of information already out there, and we can make use of this to develop our own research ideas and pilot our research questions and make sure that when it comes to testing our own hypotheses, that the data, that we have the data to back up our assumptions. So a really simple search that I did yesterday, in fact, looked just at PubMed and looked at keywords like aphasia and randomized. And there's 367 studies that have come up since 2010. So there's a lot of information out there that can be put to use even after the primary publication has been finished. So how can we work more collaboratively? So we can pool data and use data in lots of different ways, but what I'm going to concentrate on is two kind of overarching methods, let's say. The first is a project-driven approach, and this is highly specific. You identify a project that you want to do, and you identify your research questions, and you actually actively approach people and say, we want to answer this question. I know you've got data on such and such topic. It looks like it aligns with our research question. Would you mind contributing data and being part of a collaborative project so that we can answer these research questions? One caveat here is, though, you might not always have permission to reuse the data beyond the initial research purpose. So you've approached these people, you've said, I want to answer this specific research question. They give you permission to use their data to answer that research question. But then after that, what happens? You have to give the data back, or you have to destroy whatever copy of the data you have. The second approach is a non-project driven approach, where you say there's no specific project in mind, but what I'd like to do is to see what can be done if we gather a lot of data and facilitate other people's analyses across a range of different areas. In this approach, you kind of have to take what you get. So you set your criteria, but because there's no specific project or specific research question that you're asking about, you often take the data sets as they come and see what can be done afterwards. Often this approach can be quite hit and miss, because you will end up having quite wide eligibility criteria, and you find that the data that one person collected doesn't necessarily tie up with the data another data set collected. So there's when there's very little overlap, it becomes difficult to use the data. So I'm going to go through these two models just to show you what kind of things can be done. So the first example is a project-driven approach, and I'm going to use the Release project, which I think most of you are familiar with. So the aim of Release was to create a systematically developed database of individual participant data and to investigate key research questions relating to rehabilitation and recovery of people with aphasia after stroke. So Release, as I'm sure you're all very familiar with, involved 28 different countries and 174 data sets with almost 6,000 individual participant data. And we used this information to answer specific research questions. This was project-driven. We wanted to look at the natural history of language recovery following stroke-related aphasia. We wanted to look at the individual factors that contribute to recovery from aphasia. We wanted to look at components of aphasia therapy that facilitate recovery, and whether some interventions were more beneficial for some patient populations than others. And this has had impact, because from this type of analyses, what we were able to do is publish several papers. The first one being a protocol on how we analyze this kind of data in a large-scale meta-analysis, and all of the different challenges and solutions that we came up with to analyze these 174 data sets. We also published data on the participant characteristics and speech and language therapy descriptions for these research studies that contributed to Release. And what this did was also highlight differences between the level of data collection and the items that were collected in really early studies compared with later studies, and also how well recommendations that go back all the way to the 80s were being adhered to right now. It allowed us to identify and itemize and inventory what was being collected and how participants were being described. And that also had a knock-on effect of informing the Describe study, which Sarah Wallace led on. And that generated impact for participant descriptors for future aphasia studies as well. We also published a roadmap on how to create this IPD database. In this paper in particular, we detailed exactly how to go about creating such a database and all of the items that we needed to consider, from an infrastructure perspective, when creating such a database. And of course, we looked at post-stroke predictors of recovery after aphasia, which was part of our research questions. We also published on dosage intensity and frequency of language therapy and what the optimum regime was. And we also published data on precision rehabilitation, so which participants did better under which conditions. So that was a lot of different aspects of, from the research process and the methods to the actual clinical implications that we were able to address within the release project. Moving on, we do have another project coming up within CATS Working Group 1, and this is what we're calling Release 2. And essentially, we're going to be looking at functional communication as a predictor for quality of life and the associations between the different types of quality of life measures and the different functional communication measures as well. This was recently funded by the Tavistock Trust for Aphasia, and it's due to commence in November 2023 for 2 years. It will involve a lot of the same principles that were set out in the original release study. So we are going to systematically identify data sets for this IPD meta-analysis. We're going to invite data contribution and of course analyse the data according to our 2 research questions. And we do aim to publish based on this as well. Okay, moving on to a non-data driven project, and that is essentially the whole of Working Group 1, CATS Aphasia Data Sets. Our ethos is to collate and provide data for novel exploratory analyses. What we want to do is reduce research waste and to maximise the potential of data that has already been collected. So what we're going to do is we're going to build on release and our experience within the CATS collaboration. We are contacting each of the release collaborators and asking them if they're happy for us to continue to lodge their data, not for the purposes of release or release 2, but in the CATS Aphasia data set. So it will be a much more long-standing agreement where we lodge data and we use it for novel exploratory analyses. Of course, as I said before, when we're taking this kind of wide approach that is not project driven, we have to have slightly wider eligibility criteria because we want to facilitate other people's analyses. And we don't necessarily know what those analyses are going to be at this point in time. So we want to make sure we've got broad enough data to be able to facilitate some of the requests that we will get. So we're looking for any study design. It doesn't necessarily have to be an RCT. We're looking for a minimum IPD of 10 participants, and we need to have documented aphasia etiology. Before we had specified that etiology had to be stroke related, but what we are seeing moving forward, and with the agreement of our funders, of course, is that we want to look at aphasia of other etiologies as well. So we have broadened our eligibility criterion here for this particular one. We also need a documentation to be present on time since aphasia onsets. We just need to know how chronic was the aphasia when the participant was enrolled in the research study. We're requesting that language impairment was assessed at baseline and that there are repeated measures of at least one language assessment using a validated follow-up tool. So when we're using this non-project driven approach, we still have the same types of users here. We have academic research projects and academic researchers who approach us for data. We can also facilitate undergraduate, master's and PhD projects using the data. And of course, there is potential for commercial research projects to be supported here. And some of the types of things that can be answered from this are studies that can inform the design of future trials. So for example, establishing sample sizes and dropout rates for particular subpopulations. We can establish proof of concept, does a particular intervention appear to work in a particular group of participants? We can also examine the natural history of recovery as well. That one is quite tricky to look at within the context of aphasia, but if we're talking about natural history of functional communication, for example, after therapy or within set parameters, we can look at the trajectory of certain outcomes over time. So what I want to do is just to move on and really go into the detail of what is required when we're setting up this kind of resource. So in brief, the process involves setting up a research collaboration. We need very practical items such as setting up secure storage and data management plans. We need infrastructure such as a contribution process. We need to set eligibility criteria for what we want to ask people to contribute. When we're inviting contribution, who do we invite and how do we invite them? And then at the end of all of this, how do we manage access when people want to access the data for their own research studies? So looking at the research collaboration, I think the very basic things that are needed are, first off, there needs to be a chair. There needs to be identification of trialists leading the field, because what we have found from our experience in doing this is nothing beats word of mouth and nothing beats the personal connection. So if you are able to identify the people leading in the field and approach them and get support, then they also become your champions. And when they can see the benefit of the project, they can bring in other people to the project. We also establish a steering group to guide the project. And for working group 1, this is anyone who contributes a data set. So what we have said is, unlike other working groups within CATS, working group 1's membership requires you to contribute data to working group 1, because essentially our steering group are the people who will review proposals for the use of the data and make critical comments and ensure that the interpretation of the data based on these kind of novel analyses are accurate and a good interpretation of the data based on the data sources, because they know their data well. They know the conditions under which the data were collected, so they know what is an appropriate interpretation or conclusion that can be drawn from the new research. And of course, we need ethical approval. Now, within the UK, we have the IRAS system, which has a separate checkbox for setting up databases. So you don't have to go through full NHS ethics, because this doesn't involve the NHS at all. So when you're setting up the database, you can it's a separate stream for getting ethical approval there. And of course, you'll need institutional ethical approval as well. Okay, looking at setting up storage and data management, one option is to involve a clinical trials unit. They have the expertise, they have the infrastructure and all of the processes already in place for data storage. It's really important to develop a data management plan. Who will have access? How will they have access? How long will you store the data for? Where are the data stored? How regularly are they backed up? Do you have a fire safe? Do you need to put hard drives in fire safe? Really practical questions like that. We also need to set up a contribution and request procedure, because it isn't as simple as sending out an email and saying, can you please send me your data via email? It's not very secure. So we need to have a secure contribution and request procedure. We also need to allocate a data manager, someone who is familiar with data management software such as SAS or SPSS or R. The data manager is responsible for managing every aspect of the data, really, including access and contribution and development and compilation of analysis data sets. We also need to look at eligibility criteria and set these according to what our needs are. So for working group 1, I've already outlined the eligibility criteria, and they were really quite broad. But when you're setting up this kind of resource, you do need to ask, what is the field of study and what aspect of the field is most of interest? What kinds of questions do you want to be able to answer? And that's a key one. Is it strictly methodological? Is it long-term outcomes? Do you need to then add an eligibility criterion where you say that we want, you know, long-term outcomes to be included specifically? Do you want to look at particular subgroups of populations? And what kinds of data do you want to collate? So something that we are coming across with Working Group 1 is certain data sets have voice recordings, and people are offering these to us. And while it would be amazing to be able to analyze these, unfortunately for data security purposes and personally identifiable data, we can't accept voice recordings. So it is very important to think about what you want to collect first of all. Moving on to, as I said, personally identifiable data. This is a key item here because across the world, really, it's increasingly difficult to share data, and there are a lot of guidelines that you need to adhere to. Now, in Working Group 1, we don't accept any personally identifiable data. For data contribution purposes, we need to make sure that, first off, there is no personally identifiable data, that we have secure storage, that we have our backups in a separate location, and that anything that is saved to hard drives are kept in a locked file cabinet or under, you know, lock and key. As I mentioned, data protection is very important when you're dealing with any of these data sets. So identifiable data includes, but is not limited to, you know, names, ID numbers, locations, postcodes, identifiable factors specific to physical, psychological, genetic, mental, economic, cultural, or social identity as well. There's a lot that comes under identifiable data. So it is key to identify these and to involve the data protection officers at your own institutions as well. For truly anonymized data, what we need is data that cannot be backtracked to any particular individual. So there usually is a case where subject numbers or personal, report numbers are renumbered before they're sent to you, so that we can't even track back to the original participant from the original file. What needs to be taken into account is data protection by design and default. This all has to be designed at the beginning and not done retrospectively. So you build compliance into the project from the beginning and make sure you're documenting everything as you go. Now, inviting contribution, this is always different depending on the type of study you're doing and whether it's project driven or whether it's non-project driven. So you have to decide who to invite. And what always works is starting very simple. Ask who you know, because personal connections work best, and that's what we found out. However, this carries a risk of selection bias in itself. If you consider attaching a data request to a specific project, like we did with the release project, it actually works quite well because there is a common element or a common theme that everybody is then working towards. When we look at managing access, we need to think about who gets access, how physically they're going to get access, and how long they'll be able to get access as well. These are really key items to think about when you're designing your infrastructure. So in practice, how we have done this for other projects is we've done this via virtual analysis platform. Now, this is now becoming the standard for data access globally. So pharmaceutical companies who sponsor these kind of the big drug trials essentially across a lot of health conditions are making their data available to the wider scientific community, but they're not handing over their data. They are making them available via an analysis platform. So you can apply to large pharmaceutical companies and request data from specific trials. They will provide that data on an analysis platform, which then you log into using a username and password. You do your analyses and you export only your outputs rather than the data set. And you have to pre-specify how long you want access for, and your username and password expires after the pre-specified duration. That's the standard that we're working to as an industry standard, and that's what we're working to in Working Group 1 as well. Now, looking at the complexities of data management in practice, this is just a snapshot of the data management kind of flow chart that was used for release. So it is incredibly complex. It is dependent on whether data are contributed to you by a principal investigator or whether it's available from the public domain. You know, there are several steps where you do eligibility checks and then, you know, data checks for ranges and values. You have accompanying materials with the data set, such as, you know, data dictionaries, protocols, original papers, you know, a report for the funder if that's available. Then there's also the stage of cleaning the data so that it is fit for your own purpose. So the data that are contributed for CATS Working Group 1, for example, are all formatted according to what the original PI needed, but they're not necessarily formatted to what we need or what a new project will need. So all of that needs cleaned and reformatted and, you know, either renamed or, you know, variables renamed so that it matches what our new purpose is. So this is just to give you an appreciation that, you know, getting the data isn't the end step. There's a lot of data cleaning required. Governance is really important, because how do we make sure that people are using the data for their intended purpose, for what they have requested the data for, and how do we make sure that we're holding them accountable as well? So if we start on the left with data contribution means that a person becomes a representative on the Working Group 1 steering committee. So the PI for the study joins Working Group 1. We anonymise the data with respect to the study source, because what we want to do is to provide data to the scientific community where we aren't necessarily reanalyzing the original aims of the study. We don't want somebody to come and say, well, I don't agree with how they analyze the data from this big, you know, aphasia trial. I want to reanalyze it my way and see if I get a different result. That is against the ethos of why people contributed the data. So we anonymise it with respect to trial source. We hold data centrally. So at the moment, it is at Glasgow Caledonian University. And then if we move on to the right-hand side, the top right, how does people access this data? They have to submit a proposal via the CATS website. Within this, they need to define their own data requirements, because we will give access to data based on the data that they request. The proposal that they have submitted is reviewed by Working Group 1, and they can make comments on this, and they can add, you know, context and suggest analyses, appropriate analyses, knowing where the data have come from. The data set is then compiled and they're granted access via an analysis platform. So again, the data shouldn't be leaving GCU. The manuscript is then prepared based on these analyses, and it is submitted to the steering committee prior to publication. And it's at this point where the steering committee can then review and make appropriate adjustments to the manuscript as needed. And then, of course, we encourage everyone to publish. I think it's key to highlight here that there are opportunities within Working Group 1 for people who contribute data to be named as authors on subsequent papers, but obviously they need to meet the authorship criteria set out by journals. There is increasing awareness of the immense contribution that people who have collected data make to the research landscape. So the International Committee of Medical Journal Editors have stated that those who generate and share these kinds of data sets deserve this substantial credit. And those who are using these data should seek collaboration. However, because collaboration is not always possible, credit should be given, and you know, they need to be recognized by the academic community. And that is where in Working Group 1, we have said, okay, people who contribute data, if you are interested in being part of future analyses that use the data within Working Group 1, at the stage where the proposal is being circulated, they need to register their interest in being part of that proposal. That way they're involved from the beginning and they can actively take part in the analyses and meet the criteria set out by many journals. Okay, and of course there are lots of other considerations when we've got this type of database. So the first one is anonymization. We need to make sure that everything is fully anonymized. It needs to be done pre-contribution. The contributor also needs to have permission to share the data, because what we see is sometimes it's built into the original consent forms where participants are said, are asked, can we retain your data or can we share your data, fully anonymized, of course, for the purposes of future research. In other occasions, it's not written in, and the ethics committee specifically say you need to come back to the ethics committee or even go back to the original participants in some cases and seek approval for this. Now, journals now encourage data sets to be made publicly available, and CAT's Aphasia Data Sets Working Group 1 is a means to lodge IPD so that you can tick this box for journals as well. So that's just another benefit of the working group. Now, the impact of these non-project based methods is that you can facilitate a range of investigations. However, you may get proposals in and it can be hit or miss. We just may not have the data available to facilitate these projects. We might not have all the data available to do a really deep dive into the research question. However, lots of analyses can still be facilitated. And there's lots of benefits and drawbacks to this, of course. Number one, we are sharing data. We're creating an international resource. This is great. We're reducing research waste. We can generate valuable outputs. And we are generating a network of experts in the field. However, there are drawbacks. So it can be highly selective. We often see a lack of standardization in the data that are contributed. So everyone's using a different language, everyone's using a different assessment tool, different type of intervention and description of that intervention. Everyone's following up at a different time point. But what this does is it highlights a need for prospective standardized data collection and increasing how, standardization of data collection across aphasia trials. I'm just including this as a resource because there are lots of guidelines for how to deal with these large-scale research collaborations, for data management, for sharing authorship, and guidelines for reporting of IPD meta-analysis as well. And lastly, I'd just like to acknowledge our funders, the Tavistock Trust. Okay, I'll take any questions if you have any.
Thank you very much, Myzoon, for a wonderful presentation and such valuable work. So does anyone have any questions?
I have one,
Well,
if that's right.
Oh, yes, please go.
I'm interested in, I think is it the platforms, Myzoon, where, you have this limited amount of time where you can access data. I might just completely misunderstand it. Is there's not some requirement that you can go back to the original data with anything that you publish? Yes. How does that work with those systems?
Right, so what we do is, I'm going to give you an example from another data set that I coordinate. So the Virtual International Stroke Trials Archives. So there's 8 different data sets within 8 different archives within that, and we facilitate analyses mainly in stroke. The virtual analysis platform that has been set up for that. So the back end of that is managed by the Robertson Centre for Biostatistics. So whenever we get proposals in, for new projects, data are compiled and that becomes a new analysis data set that is stored at the Robertson Centre. So that's there forever, essentially. So if somebody needs to come back to that, we have it stored on the back end. All it is the username and password expire. So whenever somebody comes back to us and says, actually, the journal had a query, we need to reanalyze based on this factor and that factor, we just reissue access. Everything is still there where they left it. It's just that they can no longer access it.
Thank you. Yeah, that makes sense. Really interesting. Thank you.
I think there's a lot of technical expertise that needs to be kind of taken into account with a lot of the back end stuff. It seems quite simple when you're doing it for a specific project when you have access to the data yourself, but when it kind of gets scaled up, you do need that kind of, you know, back end expertise with the people with the server and the IT knowledge and all the rest of that. Yeah.
Myzoon, would you be able to explain a bit more about when data, so outcome measures haven't been standardized or aren't common, what the challenges are or limits are with that and how you approach it?
Right, so there's a couple of different ways to approach it. I know that within systematic reviews, you take standard means of the groups, regardless of the assessment tool that are used. When you're doing IPD meta-analysis, there's two ways of doing it. Either you say, you know, a priori, I want to look at changes on the ANELT, and that's it. And so data are compiled on ANELT alone, and that means anything else, like, you know, any other assessment tool is not included in your analysis data set. That's one approach, but what that does is limits the data as well. The other approach is what we used in release, where we transformed all of the data to match a standard, you know, a standard measure, essentially. Now, that transformation algorithm has been used in the past, and what it does is it converts like for like within the same domains of assessment. So it is incredibly challenging, I would say that. It's about selecting what you need for your purposes and making sure that you're not wasting data. I think it depends on your level of resource as well, because if it's easier just to use a single assessment tool and give results based on a single assessment tool, that's fine, go ahead. You often end up with a smaller sample size with that, though. If you're going to do a little bit more kind of methodological work on all of these different assessment tools, I think the transformation algorithm is possibly a way to go, because it allows you to really maximize the data. But I will say, within the transformation algorithms kind of method, you do have to identify exactly what each assessment tool measures, the direction of scoring, what are the contents of each different assessment tool, can they be amalgamated in the same way? Because especially in the field of cognition, everything measures, the measures are so intricate and they measure so many different domains of cognition that combining, you know, combining something that looks specifically at attention may not necessarily combine well with something that looks at alertness and orientation. They're asking two slightly different questions. So it does require a deep dive into the different assessment tools and the components as well.
Great, thank you. Are there any other questions? If there aren't any, we might wrap it up there, but thank you again, Myzoon, for a wonderful talk and overview of Working Group 1. And I'd encourage people, if you're interested, to get in contact.
Yes, absolutely.
Thanks, everybody. Okay.
Thanks, everybody. Thank you. Bye.